All right, it's time to start the last unit here, which is on Alzheimer's disease. I have good news and bad news for you on this particular one. The good news is I know a lot about this. I used to do national presentations on Alzheimer's disease, so I guess that's the good news. The bad news is I'll try to keep my comments relatively short here, but it will be a couple of presentations here, and hopefully you'll learn a lot about Alzheimer's disease. I did like the post you folks had, but I think my job is to teach you kind of the nuts and bolts, and hopefully this will be helpful to you. We're going to cover mostly the neurobiology thing, but I always like to start this presentation off and once again just take a good detailed outline of the information and summarize kind of these abstracts and other things. The question I always like to start with is, if you were going to be diagnosed with the disease, which one of the three would you least want to have? Asthma, depression, or Alzheimer's disease? Asthma, depression, or Alzheimer's disease? Most people, when you ask them that question, they say, oh yeah, Alzheimer's disease. I really wouldn't want to have Alzheimer's disease. The question is, and what I want you to take a few notes on, is why would you least want to have Alzheimer's disease? Well, a couple of things. First of all, asthma and depression tend to kind of just wreck your quality of life. They tend to cause more issues with morbidity, or just quality of life, miss school days, can't function well some days. Alzheimer's in the end will cause mortality. So it'll cause mortality, which is certainly a much worse outcome, number one. So we've certainly got that going on. And then maybe a second reason, if you really want to get into it, is how are we as a culture at dealing with the idea that we're going to be facing our own mortality? We don't deal with that particularly well. Western society and medicine is really against the idea about the process of death. So it is a very difficult process to talk about. Cost. Alzheimer's disease ends up costing a great deal of money to the person going through it, to the family as well. Asthma and depression certainly can, but not to the extent that Alzheimer's disease can. Maybe another important reason, think about what Alzheimer's does to your personality. It basically wrecks your ability to remember things, and it changes your personality. It'll cause dementia. And if you think what's really essential about who each of us is, memory and personality are probably the two main features that really define us. So this is going to be a mortality-based event. It's going to be expensive. A lot of our elderly population are facing this disease, and it certainly makes it very difficult. The good news I have to report to you is the federal government is really working on this. There is the Alzheimer's Association. They get a lot of grant funding and do a lot of good research. You may want to look at that if you need to get a resource. The NIH does a lot of research with this as well, so we're learning a lot about the disease of Alzheimer's. So the next thing I want to do is really, from the purpose of our class, share with you some information about the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm going to share the story. You should probably write some of this down. The visual here, the newspaper thing or the article I have, I think covers this pretty well. So it all starts with chromosome 21. We all have chromosome 21, but for those that get Alzheimer's disease, chromosome 21, actually I should say we all have chromosome 21, and we all have something called amyloid precursor protein, APP. Every one of us has amyloid precursor protein in our bodies. But what's really unique is, although we all have amyloid precursor protein, something unique happens when we get Alzheimer's disease. For those of us who are going to get Alzheimer's disease, amyloid precursor protein gets cleaved, gets cut by something called beta and gamma secretases. Beta and gamma secretase. And when amyloid precursor protein gets cut by beta and gamma secretase, it leads to the formation of beta peptide. It leads to the formation of beta peptide. This beta peptide is a very bad thing, because for those that are going to get Alzheimer's disease with the beta and gamma secretases cleaving amyloid precursor protein, this beta peptide becomes neurotoxic in the brain. This A beta peptide becomes neurotoxic, and it really starts destroying lots of healthy cells in the brain. Lots of healthy cells in the brain. And it basically will cause these amyloid plaques to form. Now, your brain recognizes this, and your brain recognizes that something's going wrong, and it actually starts a process of inflammation in your brain. So your brain starts having an inflammatory response. One of the cells that comes in there, kind of on the left side of your document if you're making a little outline, are things called microglia. Microglia comes in as part of the immune system response and tries to destroy these plaques. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. What tends to happen is the microglia starts destroying healthy neurons, especially neurons containing acetylcholine. So it'll destroy acetylcholine neurons. It'll also cause some changes for glutamate neurons as well. So we know that that's part of the process of what's going on with the neuropathology. That inflammation happens, microglia comes in and ends up destroying healthy neurons, especially neurons containing acetylcholine. The other thing that happens during the inflammatory process is another thing that goes on related to the inflammatory process is chromosome 19. Chromosome 19 codes for a very important protein, and the name of the protein is called apolipoprotein E. Apolipoprotein E. And apolipoprotein E has three different alleles, three different ways of expressing itself. So let me start with the first way of what happens when apolipoprotein E2 is expressed. When E2 is expressed, a neuron basically gets to keep its structure. A neuron gets to keep its structure or shape. So when E2 is expressed, a neuron gets to keep its shape, its structure, and the neuron is composed in a healthy, reasonable way. But when people get Alzheimer's disease, instead of having apolipoprotein E2 expressed, instead we see the expression of a particular type of apolipoprotein called E4. When apolipoprotein E4 is expressed, that seems to cause some problems. The neuron loses its ability to keep its structure. One of my favorite old shows, if you ever watched it, was Star Trek The Next Generation. Whenever they were on the ship and they said, "Captain, we have a breach in structural integrity." A breach in structural integrity was never a good thing. It meant the ship was about to blow up because it was losing its structure, its shape, and it was going to, blow a fuse, as they say. So the same thing happens when apolipoprotein E4 is expressed. When apolipoprotein E4 is expressed, the neuron seems to lose its structural integrity, and the neuron will basically crumble, which leads to the formation of these tangles. And so apolipoprotein is formed. Apolipoprotein, by the way, is very related to LDL, low-density lipoprotein, which is the bad cholesterol. So this is the pathology that we seem to have with Alzheimer's disease. Let me kind of paraphrase again. Chromosome 21 codes for amyloid precursor protein. And when we have amyloid precursor protein, that will lead to beta and gamma secretase cleaving that long chain protein, leading to the formation of beta peptide. Beta peptide becomes neurotoxic, leads to the formation of plaques. Then we have the brain recognizing this and having the inflammatory response. Microglia comes in, tries to destroy the bad cells, but it doesn't. Instead, it destroys acetylcholine. And chromosome 19 leads to the expression of apolipoprotein E4. And E4 leads to the neuron basically crumbling and losing its structural integrity, because it's also very related to LDL, and the neuron crumbles and forms tangles. So that is the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease. We know this, and there are basically 27 research centers around the country doing research on this, trying to figure out what we can do to intervene with this. So that'll be the next recording. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.